played these games before. I played these games before. I played these games before. These days before. I played these games 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 before. These days before. I played these games 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 before. These days before. I played these games 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 before. These days before. I played these games 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 before. These days before. I played these games 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 before. These days before. I played these games 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 before. These days before. I played these games before. I played these games before. I played these games before. Friendly stains the four, four. Friendly stains the four, four. The four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four. Friendly stains the four. Friendly stains the four. Friendly stains the four. Friendly stains the four. The four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four. Friendly stains the four. Friendly stains the four, four. Friendly stains the four, four. Friendly stains the four. Friendly stains the four, four. Friendly stains the four, four. The four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four. Friendly stains the four. Friendly stains the four. Friendly stains the four. Friendly stains the four. The four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four. Friendly stains the four. Friendly stains the four, four. Friendly stains the four, four. Friendly stains the four. Friendly stains the four, four. Friendly stains the four, four. The four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four. Friendly stains the four. Friendly stains the four. Friendly stains the four. Friendly stains the four. The four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four. Friendly stains the four. Friendly stains the four, four. Friendly stains the four, four. Friendly stains the four. Friendly stains the four, four. Friendly stains the four, four. The four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four. Friendly stains the four. Friendly stains the four. Friendly stains the four. Friendly stains the four. The four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four. Friendly stains the four. Friendly stains the four, four. Friendly stains the four, four. Friendly stains the four. Friendly stains the four, four. Friendly stains the four, four. The four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four. Friendly stains the four. Friendly stains the four. Friendly stains the four. Friendly stains the four. The four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four. Ladies came the four, four. Ladies came the four, four. Ladies came the four. Ladies came the four, four. Ladies came the four, four. The four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four. Ladies came the four. Ladies came the four. Ladies came the four. Ladies came the four. The four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four. Ladies came the four. Ladies came the four, four. Ladies came the four, four. Ladies came the four. Ladies came the four, four. Ladies came the four, four. The four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four. Ladies came the four. Ladies came the four. Ladies came the four. Ladies came the four. The four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four. Ladies came the four. Ladies came the four, four. Ladies came the four, four. Ladies came the four. Ladies came the four, four. Ladies came the four, four. The four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four. Ladies came the four. Ladies came the four. Ladies came the four. Ladies came the four. The four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four. Ladies came the four. Ladies came the four, four. Ladies came the four, four. Ladies came the four. Ladies came the four, four. Ladies came the four, four. The four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four. Ladies came the four. Ladies came the four. Ladies came the four. Ladies came the four. The four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four. Ladies came the four. Ladies came the four, four. Ladies came the four, four. Ladies came the four. Ladies came the four, four. Ladies came the four, four. The four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four. Ladies came the four. Ladies came the four. Ladies came the four. Ladies came the four. The four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four. Ladies came the four. Ladies came the four, four. Ladies came the four, four. Ladies came the four. Ladies came the four, four. Ladies came the four, four. The four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four. Ladies came the four. Ladies came the four. Ladies came the four. Ladies came the four. The four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four. Ladies came the four. Ladies came the four, four. Ladies came the four, four. Ladies came the four. Ladies came the four, four. Ladies came the four, four. The four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four. Ladies came the four. Ladies came the four. Ladies came the four. Ladies came the four. The four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four. I played this game before. 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 four, four, and we stays the four, four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four, and we stays 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 the four, 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 and we stays the four. And we stays the four, four, and we stays the four, four, and we stays the four, and we stays the four, four, and we stays the four, four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four, and we stays 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 the four, 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 and we stays the four. And we stays the four, four, and we stays the four, four, and we stays the four, and we stays the four, four, and we stays the four, four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four, and we stays 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 the four, 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 and we stays the four. And we stays the four, four, and we stays the four, four, and we stays the four, and we stays the four, four, and we stays the four, four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four, and we stays 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 the four, 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 and we stays the four. And we stays the four, four, and we stays the four, four, and we stays the four, and we stays the four, four, and we stays the four, four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four, and we stays 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 the four, 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 and we stays the four. And we stays the four, four, and we stays the four, four, and we stays the four, and we stays the four, four, and we stays the four, four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four, and we stays 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 the four, 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 and we stays the four. And we stays the four, four, and we stays the four, four, and we stays the four, and we stays the four, four, and we stays the four, four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four, and we stays 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 the four, 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 and we stays the four. And we stays the four, four, and we stays the four, four, and we stays the four, and we stays the four, four, and we stays the four, four, stays the four, four. Riley stays the four, four. Riley stays the four. Riley stays the four, four. Riley stays the four, four. The four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four. Riley stays the four. Riley stays the four. Riley stays the four. Riley stays the four. The four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four. Riley stays the four. Riley stays the four, four. Riley stays the four, four. Riley stays the four. Riley stays the four, four. Riley stays the four, four. The four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four. Riley stays the four. Riley stays the four. Riley stays the four. Riley stays the four. The four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four, the four. Riley stays the four. Riley stays the four, four. Riley stays the four, four. Riley stays